The Midnight Train to Nowhere by Martha M.C. Jenkins. The whistle shrieked, a sound more of a tortured spirit than a steam engine rending the midnight air. Elias Thorne, historian by trade, haunted by choice, shivered despite the oppressive stillness. The station, if one could call it that, was a desolate platform shrouded in a perpetual inky darkness, devoid of clocks or schedules. The sign above the tracks read, in faded, archaic script, "Midnight Train to Nowhere." He clutched his worn leather satchel, a repository of historical anxieties, much like his own mind. He'd come seeking solace from a past he couldn't outrun, a redemption he knew he didn't deserve. He hadn't quite expected to find it on a ghost train. A few other figures emerged from the gloom. Seraphina Bell, a nurse, her immaculate white uniform stark against the night, her face a mask of reserved sorrow. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled as she adjusted her bag. Arthur Finch, an accountant, paced nervously, his eyes darting, his suit jacket rumpled, clearly fleeing a different kind of ruin. And then there was Clara, a bride in a mud-splattered white gown, veil torn, clutching a wilted bouquet, her eyes wide with a desperate, frantic terror. She was running, that much was clear, but from what or to where, none could say. The train itself was an anachronism, a sleek, almost modern outer shell that belied the dark, antique wood and brass within. The doors hissed open. A faint, sweet smell, like old blood and forgotten dust, wafted out. Hesitantly, one by one, they boarded. The moment Elias stepped inside, the doors slammed shut with a finality that echoed in his bones. There was no going back. The train lurched forward with a groan, plunging them into absolute darkness for a moment, before the car's interior lights flickered on. This first car was a jarring anachronism. It was a replica of a turn-of-the-century railway car, but warped. The plush velvet seats were discolored, the brass fittings tarnished with the green patina of age. A thick, cloying smell of formaldehyde and ether hung in the air, mixed with a faint metallic tang. On every seat, even the empty ones, small, faded labels were tied, each bearing a single chilling word: pneumonia, influenza, consumption. Elias, the historian, felt a chill deeper than the train's spectral air. "The Great Plague," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "No, the influenza pandemic of 1918. The car vibrated with a low, oppressive hum, and a distant, phantom cough seemed to echo from the walls. Seraphina, her face pale, instinctively reached for the pulse point on her wrist. Arthur wrung his hands, muttering about market crashes, his personal ruin feeling insignificant in the face of such widespread, historical despair. Clara, still clutching her bouquet, looked around with a dazed, lost expression, as if sensing a new, more profound tragedy than her own. A shuffling sound announced the arrival of the conductor. Old Man Hemlock was his name, though Elias had heard it only whispered on the platform. He was ancient, his face a road map of wrinkles, his eyes like chips of obsidian, seeing too much. His uniform was an impeccably tailored but threadbare relic adorned with forgotten insignia. "Tickets, please," Hemlock rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. His gaze lingered on each passenger, an unnerving, knowing intensity. "Mind the journey. It is long, and the destination undefined." No one had a ticket. Hemlock simply nodded, as if expecting this. "Some journeys are not paid for with coin," he said, his lips curling into a knowing, unsettling smile. "Some demand a different currency. The train sped on, the world outside a blur of impenetrable darkness. The car seemed to press in on them, the air growing heavier, thick with the unsaid. The train stopped. No jolt, just a creeping halt. The doors again remained sealed. A cacophony of distant, echoing screams, metallic rending, and the stench of burning oil and coal infused the air. The car around them shifted, subtly at first, then violently. The velvet was replaced by splintered wood and rusted iron beams. The light flickered, casting grotesque shadows. Industrial soot coated everything. A factory collapse, Elias breathed, identifying the era. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, or one of its many forgotten brethren. The air choked him, not with smoke, but with the imagined breathlessness of those trapped beneath the rubble. Arthur clutched his chest, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "My ledgers, the safety report, I filed it, I swear," he cried out, a different kind of horror contorting his face. He wasn't speaking of this historical disaster, but his own. Serafina watched him, a flicker of understanding, or perhaps recognition, in her eyes. Clara merely wept, a silent, desperate rain. They couldn't stay. An unseen force, cold and relentless, pushed them through a doorway into the next car. This one was a ballroom, magnificent yet decayed, frozen in a moment of terrible grace. Chandeliers hung at precarious angles. A grand piano lay overturned, its keys bared like broken teeth. Water dripped, slow and mournful, from the ceiling. A bone-deep cold seeped into their very marrow. The distant sound of a string quartet playing a jaunty tune was swallowed by the groaning, splitting sound of metal. "The Titanic," Elias whispered, his teeth chattering. "The unsinkable, sinking." He could almost feel the crush of bodies against the lifeboats, the icy embrace of the Atlantic. Serafina hugged herself, a phantom shiver seizing her. "The children," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "They cried for their mothers." Her eyes were distant, filled with an ancient, personal grief. The stops continued, each car a new nightmare, rewinding through time, each reflecting a catastrophe born of human hubris, neglect, or malice. They passed through a war-torn carriage, splattered with what might have been dried blood, the air vibrating with the distant thrum of artillery. Then a dark, oppressive chamber with gallows ropes hanging like macabre decorations, the pervasive smell of burning wood and paranoia clinging to the air. "The Salem witch trials," Elias identified, his voice growing thin, fear devouring innocence. As the train delved deeper into the past, the memories, or impressions, grew more vivid, more personal. Shared visions began to plague them. Flashes of a common face, a young woman with kind, haunted eyes, her skin pale, her breath shallow. A name whispered on the spectral wind. Lily. Lily. The name resonated with a chilling familiarity within each of them. Elias saw her in the great plague car, thin and coughing, ignored by a crowded, fearful populace. He saw her in the factory car, slumped against a wall amidst the chaos, her face smeared with soot, her hand outstretched. He saw her in the Titanic car, clinging to a broken spar, her cries lost in the roar of the ocean. He began to piece it together, the historian's mind finding patterns where only chaos seemed to exist. These weren't just historical tragedies. They were reflections, distorted mirrors of a single central tragedy they all shared. Old Man Hemlock reappeared, standing at the threshold of the next car. His obsidian eyes seemed to penetrate their very souls. "The past is a debt," he intoned, his voice echoing in the claustrophobic space. "And debts eventually come due." The next car was different. It wasn't a grand historical tableau. It was mundane. A derelict city apartment, dimly lit, the wallpaper peeling. A single rickety bed in the corner, a dusty window overlooking a grimy alley. The air was cold, stale, and smelled of neglect and desperation. This car felt less like a disaster and more like a consequence. And in the bed, lying still, was Lily. Not a vision, not a ghost of the past, but her. Her face was pale, eyes closed, a faint, almost imperceptible rise and fall of her chest. She looked weak, fragile, utterly alone. Terror, primal and cold, gripped them. They were no longer observers. They were participants. "Lily," Serafina breathed, stumbling forward. She reached out a trembling hand, then hesitated, pulling back. A flash of memory. Serafina, in her pristine nurse's uniform, looking at Lily's chart, noting the alarming symptoms, the lack of proper care, the desperate pleas for help. She had dismissed them, citing hospital policy, lack of beds, understaffing. She had turned away. She had a secret. A patient, neglected, had died. Arthur collapsed onto a splintered wooden chair, burying his face in his hands. "The eviction notices, the rent hike," he sobbed. He saw himself, younger, sharper, pushing papers, approving the property development that had forced Lily and her family out of their meager home. He had known the consequences, had brushed them aside for profit. He was escaping ruin, but had caused it for others. Clara, her bridal gown, now a symbol of her aborted escape, stood frozen, her bouquet slipping from her fingers. She saw herself arguing with Lily, dismissing her pleas for help. Lily had needed a place to stay, a kind word, an ally. Clara had been too focused on her own upcoming wedding, her own future, her own happiness. She had abandoned Lily, chasing her own selfish dreams. Elias, the historian, stood apart, his face etched with a profound, self-loathing horror. He remembered now. He had seen Lily, had witnessed her deteriorating condition, had heard the whispers of her plight. He had even planned to write an exposé, a historical piece on the forgotten poor. But he'd hesitated, fearing the damage to his reputation, the risks to his career. He had let his academic ambition overshadow his humanity. He had remained silent. He had sought redemption, but had done nothing to earn it. They had all been there, in different ways at different times. They had formed a silent, unwitting conspiracy of neglect, ambition, and self-interest. They had judged Lily's worth and found her wanting. Their collective indifference had been a slow, agonizing blade. "Do you remember now?" Hemlock's voice was a low growl from the doorway, his eyes burning with an ancient fire. "Each of you a thread in the noose, each of you a stone in the river that drowned her." The train jolted violently, throwing them off balance. The car began to shift again, but this time it was not to another historical disaster. It was to a memory, a moment. The car transformed into a grimy alleyway, rain slicking the pavement. A figure lay huddled in the puddles, small and still. Lily. She was barely breathing, her eyes fluttering open, seeking help, recognition. And then a car, too fast, tires screeching on the wet asphalt. A sickening thud. A final, desperate gasp. A hit and run. Elias saw himself, turning away from the window of his research office, hearing the sound, dismissing it as just another urban tragedy, too busy with his books. Serafina, rushing past the alley entrance in her uniform, hurrying to her shift, hearing the distant commotion, thinking of her appointment. Arthur, in his expensive car, turning the corner, slowing for a moment, seeing the body, and then speeding away, panicked, thinking of his financial troubles, his ruined life, a hit on his record that would be the final nail. Clara, on her mobile phone, arguing with her fiancé, oblivious, running from her own wedding, too consumed by her own crisis to notice the quiet horror in the periphery. Lily's death was not a single grand act, but the culmination of their individual failures to see, to act, to care. It was the gruesome death they were all linked by, a collective abandonment. The alley faded. The car dissolved around them, leaving them standing on a desolate platform, identical to the one where they had boarded. The air was cold, the darkness absolute. The midnight train to nowhere stood before them, its polished brass and dark wood gleaming under an unseen light. The doors hissed open. The train's whistle shrieked, a sound of tortured spirit. Old Man Hemlock stood by the open doors, his lips curled into that knowing, unnerving smile. "All aboard," he rasped. "The journey continues." Elias looked at Serafina, her face now stripped bare of its reserve, hollowed by her guilt. He looked at Arthur, slumped and broken. He looked at Clara, her beautiful gown a shroud, her eyes vacant. They were still strangers, yet bound by an invisible, unbreakable chain. They had not paid their debt. They had merely arrived at the beginning of its repayment. Hesitantly, one by one, they reboarded the midnight train to nowhere. The doors hissed shut, and the whistle shrieked again, carrying them into the endless night, into the repeating cycle of their own making. The smell of old blood and forgotten dust and the phantom coughs of the great pandemic awaited them in the first car.